this week we're gonna go over sissy squats. A lot of people automatically assume whenever they hear sissy squats, they're thinking of an apparatus that locks their ankles and their knees into position, and they're just kind of, pivoting around their knee joint. It's just really like shearing their knee. Most people associate it with pretty bad pain. But the way that I think of sissy squats is a little bit different. So this is kind of an old school movement. A lot of people have maybe seen it, but thought like, oh my God, my knees would explode if I ever tried that. So not actually. So I will go ahead and just run through how we're gonna do this and how we will actually make it a very knee-friendly and very healthy movement long-term. So the best way to do this is to start assisted. So you can get to a point where you do it unassisted, you do it full body weight, but most people are just not gonna have that strength or that knee integrity to be able to do that. So we'll start assisted. I like to do it with setting up a bar so that I can keep my shoulders square, I can distribute my load evenly, and I can keep my hips and my trunk nice and level rather than trying to hold on to one side or something, like on one or the other side, which might rotate me as I go through it. This makes it a little bit easier to do. So what we're gonna do here is we are going to hold on to the barbell like so. We're gonna have our feet just in front of the bar, so you'll note that you're kind of leaning into it. You have to actually kind of put yourself off balance to do it. I like to kind of get a little bit of a duck stance, so you'll see how my toes are angled out a little bit, and my stance and my feet are actually a little bit more narrow than a traditional squat stance, and that is actually the way that we want it here. So from here, we're going to keep our hips extended, our glutes contracted, and from knee to the tip of my head, needs to stay completely straight, rigid as a board. And we're going to slowly allow our knees to drift over our toes and let ourselves down and then back up. So if you do it correctly, you should feel a very, very, very strong stretch through your quads and through your hip flexors. It's totally normal. That's exactly what you should feel. This is a very lengthening movement for your quads and for your hip flexors. And for some people, they're gonna feel a lot of strain and pulling at their knee. It's one of the reasons I recommend doing this movement maybe a little bit later in a leg session, or even just after you really, really, really warm up your knees, so it's not going in cold and you're not just stretching and lengthening cold tissue. You wanna make sure there's some blood flowing through there. But again, tinker with your foot position, what feels the most normal on your ankles, on your feet, and on your knees. As you perform this, again, lower yourself slowly and push the range of motion as you feel comfortable and as your tissues get acclimated every rep. You should be able to go a little bit further every single rep. Maybe you get a little bit more confident and comfortable with it. Give yourself a little bit more tension rather than fully assisting. But the key here is to just use your upper body as a guide rather than to really pull yourself. So hold on as much as you need to actually help out and to balance, but you don't really want to pull all of the load with your upper body. Still distribute that into your into your quads and allow your knees to hold on to that load as well. So here, hips extended, knees pushed forward onto your toes, full stretch, and back up. And lastly, you should notice how slow that eccentric is. And that is by design. That eccentric has to be extremely, extremely controlled to do this safely. If you're rushing through the eccentric, if you're just powering through, repping these out, your knees, your quads, your hip flexors are gonna be at a much higher risk of injury, also maybe slight tears, like little tweaks. You don't want that. We're really, again, working through the really deep range of motion, deep stretch. So take it slow, get that full stretch, embrace it, push a little bit further every single rep, and then you will be totally good, totally healthy. And this is actually gonna be a great movement for strengthening your knees rather than destroying them. So now as we're going into the mistakes that are very common with the sissy squat here, and I like to think of this or call it just a bodyweight sissy squat or an assisted sissy squat, whatever makes the most sense to actually differentiate it from the apparatus-based sissy squat that I was talking about a second ago. So whenever we're doing this, again, very, very important to think about keeping your hips extended the entire time. So the first mistake that most people make is just not keeping their hips fully locked out and allowing for breaking, allowing for hip flexion as they're performing the movement, which will actually take away from that full lengthening, full stretching component of our quads, which is again, what the primary intent of the movement is. So if you're going through here and you get to a point where you start to feel a little bit weak, maybe you can't maintain this position and your hips drop down like this, that doesn't have the same effect as full hip extension does. So full hip extension, full lengthening of the quads and hip flexors, good. Hip flexion, dropping your hips, low hips, bad. We don't want that. Second thing here is going to be having your feet in the wrong position or just not really controlling for what they're doing, where they're going, and also how your knees are tracking. So if you'll remember, I mentioned how I like to have my feet a little bit ducked out, a little bit pointed out. That's by design. So that tracks a little bit more comfortably with how my hips are actually, how they're functioning and how they're actually anatomically positioned, because I have a little bit more of an open pelvic position, which means that I naturally have a little bit more external rotation, as you can see. So for me, whenever I squat, my knees actually naturally go out. That's the reason why my toes have to be ducked out a little bit, because that's my normal pattern. If I had my knees straight on like this, I'd actually get a lot more shearing at my knees. And again, this movement is not inherently dangerous or damaging to your knees, but if everything is not perfectly lined up, it can put unnecessary stress on the knee joint. So however your knees and your feet need to be positioned and lined up to create the most efficient transfer of force through your knees and through your ankles, go ahead and do that. Pay a lot of attention to that, because that is actually going to be what is going to strengthen and keep your knees healthy long term. And lastly, big mistake that I see a lot of people run into whenever they're performing this movement is using too much upper body assistance and just pulling themselves up. So again, I mentioned this briefly a second ago, but whenever you're doing this, you want to use your upper body as a guide to balance yourself out rather than to pull yourself up. So we're not performing inverted rows, we're not performing rack pull-ups here. So keep your hands on the bar, but softly, and just use the bar to guide yourself up, assist as needed as you start to feel fatigued, as you need maybe a little bit more tension relieved at the bottom where you're in the most vulnerable position. Totally fine, but you don't want to just be pulling yourself through the entire range of motion, because that completely defeats the purpose. You're not actually putting any tension, any load into your quads, which again, it's an exercise, so we want tension through the quads. That is pretty much the extent of where all of the mistakes, general errors are gonna come from, but I still do want to make a last mention of control. So this movement, all about control, all about full lengthening of the quads, all about keeping your hips extended. If you're not able to slow the eccentric all the way down, even sometimes, pause in that deep stretch, that really, really lengthened position at the bottom, and embrace that, allow your tissue to actually handle that, you're going to be doing yourself a disservice and potentially even harming yourself. So very, very nice 4-5 second even eccentric, maybe a pause at the bottom, nice controlled concentric. This doesn't need to be powerful or explosive. It needs to be methodical. So if you can get all those things right, this movement is actually gonna be awesome for not only your quads, but also your knee integrity long term.